name's Jesse, and this is my audience. How many of you own a gun or have ever thought about owning a gun before? All right, we got a couple, that's good. Today I want to talk to you about why it's important to have continued gun ownership in America. I was originally from Indiana, and I spent the last 2 years living there before moving back to Georgia. And one thing that I noticed in Indiana recently is they're having a growing opiate addiction problem there. There's been lots of cases of burglaries and even murders into the area. So I think that can bring a certain credibility to the topic of gun ownership. This topic is important because the world's becoming more and more dangerous as we move into 2018, 2019. And so owning a gun will be important to defending yourself, and what's more valuable than a human life? Today I'll specifically be talking about the importance of gun ownership in relation to inadequate emergency response times, the lack of prevalence of an actual gun violence epidemic, and lastly I'll be talking about the ineffectiveness of current gun laws. My first thing I'd like to talk about is emergency response times. According to data collected from York, Pennsylvania Police, it revealed that shift changes, lunch hours, times of day, and location can all have an influence on response times. And this research was gathered by John Stevens. And if you look at the chart that I have here, it shows that between 7 and 8 a.m., 11 and 12 o'clock, noon and 1 p.m., 2 and 3 p.m., 3 and 4 p.m., and 10 and 11 p.m., there's the average response time is 8 minutes, roughly, but during these specific times, they exceed the average by anywhere from 2 to nearly 5 minutes. And when we consider these times, it's really important because a lot of times you're actually home during these times of day. During the morning, you might be getting ready for work. You might come home from work on your lunch break, and you're home at night when you go to sleep. So there's a greater chance that you might actually be home during a burglary, possibly. And police do everything that they can to arrive to the scene of a crime, but in certain cases, there's some things that you just can't account for. So owning a gun allows you to respond quicker. Now, some of the other reasons that we see some of these things is due to locations. Here we have Census Tract 1, 7, 11, and 13. In Census Tract 1 and 7, these are essentially districts that the police work in. There's they actually exceed the average by 1.5 minutes to nearly 2 minutes. So they actually get there even faster. But in tracts 11 and 13, we see that they exceed the average by roughly 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. And the reason for this is due to your location. People that live closer to the police department tend to have faster response times. And in this study, the people that lived on the far eastern side of the city had an excess because they weren't able to get to them or they weren't able to get to them as quickly. And many of the reasons for this are due to things like morning rush hours and evening rush hours. There's congestion that can occur, and even automobile accidents can back up a police officer from getting there in time. In addition to this, call volumes can have an influence on it too. The places that receive high call volume might not be able to respond as quickly to everyone who has an emergency. This is important for all of us moving forward because although we don't all live in cities, right now we're currently in a stage of urbanization, which means since the Industrial Revolution, we've actually been moving towards city life. So while you might live in a rural area today, your relatives in the future might live in the city. So this will be important for all of us. Next, I want to talk about why it's important, or why gun violence is actually exaggerated. And the reason for this is if we look at Albert Rees and the Uniform Crime Reporting and National Crime Survey, there's actually more deaths in 1977 that occurred from transportation accidents than guns. And according to these stats, 47,876 deaths occurred by traffic accident, but only 19,120 were from homicides. And you'll see, according to this pie chart, that the blue area represents automobile accidents, and it's actually over half the chart. And the other colors of green, red, light blue, and orange represent other kinds of transportation accidents. They equal almost as much as the purple here, which is homicides. On top of this, these homicides, 76% of them that were conducted were actually without the use of a weapon. And we can assume that the ones that were used, they did use a weapon, it could actually have been in self-defense. So there's actually less gun homicides than you would think. So there's no reason to fear guns, so that's, we should have guns. Lastly, I wanted to talk about why gun laws are inefficient and why this isn't a solution. Existing gun laws do not work because removing guns from law-abiding citizens takes them out of law-abiding citizens' hands and puts them into the hands of law-avoiding criminals. According to the Journal of Law and Economics and David Mustard, changes in gun laws have not deterred gun violence on police. And we can see in these statistics that he's compiled that between 1977 and 2005, states that allowed carrying permits for citizens saw a reduction in police deaths as a result, compared to states that did not allow them. And we can also see in a separate chart that he compiled that states that required waiting permits versus states that did not, it was effective in reducing police deaths at first, but by 1995 it actually evens out between both. So waiting for a gun actually isn't benefiting somebody who's a law-abiding citizen, because it's not having an influence or it's not creating more deaths, but it's not lowering them either. There's also a problem with states that are adjacent to states that have lax laws. An example would be Illinois. Illinois has very strict gun laws, but it's adjacent to states such as Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, and Wisconsin, which have very lax laws. And because of this, we actually see more gun trafficking going from the lax states to the stricter states. And this is actually creating a proliferation of a black market trade that wasn't existent before, but has actually gained more momentum as a result of gun laws. And this also brings in a question that you could see not only interstate trafficking occurring, but cross-border from one country to another. So while we have gun laws, we have more guns as a result that are being circulated still. So in conclusion, we talked about why emergency response levels are not adequate enough to meet an emergency. We talked about gun violence is not as prevalent as people would think, and we also talked about how gun laws are not actually reducing deaths. So in conclusion, I wanted to offer you a quote that wraps these concepts together, and it was by Clint Eastwood. And he says, in his quote, he says, "I have a very strict gun control policy. If there's a gun around, I want to be in control of it." Thank you for coming to my speech today, and here's my audience one more time.